Welcome to the part 2 of the history of translation. I'm Stenza Augustine from the Department of English. This is Translation Studies course. Just to refresh your memory, we were discussing Susan Basnett's division of the history of translation theory from her book titled Translation Studies. We already saw the development of translation during the time of ancient Romans, during Bible translations in England, how translation helped in education and the spread of the vernacular in Europe, some early theorists like Etienne Dolet, George Chapman, and we also saw how translation inspired some great works in English Renaissance period. Now we are moving on to the 17th century. In the 17th century, translation of the classics increased considerably in France between 1625 and 1660. This was the great age of French classicism and of the flowering of French theatre based on the Aristotelian unities. French writers and theories were in turn enthusiastically translated into English. Sir John Denham, a poet and translator of the 17th century England, stood against literal translation, especially in the case of poetry. Generally, we can say that the 17th century translations were not very strict, and the translator who held torch to this practice was Abraham Cowley, the English poet, essayist, and translator. John Dryden, another English writer, tackled the problems of translations by formulating three basic types. He said that in these three ways a translator can approach a source text. First, metaphrase. Metaphrase is where we translate word by word and line by line from one language into another. Second is paraphrase, which is the old sense for sense style preferred by Cicero. And the third is imitation, where the translator abandons the source text as he sees fit. That means he can make any changes, take what he can and leave what he hates from the source text. Any guess what method Dryden preferred? He liked the second method, the paraphrasing. It makes sense because it was a more balanced form of translation. Dryden's views on translation were followed fairly closely by Alexander Pope, another English poet and an expert in translation. But unfortunately, Dryden's paraphrasing led to so many loose translations by other writers, and they were of lower standards and of less artistic value. Now we are going to the 18th century. 18th century gave more importance to the readability of the text rather than the rules and regulations when texts were translated. Goethe, the famous German poet and writer, argued that every literature must pass through three phases of translation. First, the text should acquaint us to the foreign countries in our own terms. That means if we, Indians, are the target readers of a work that was, say, originally published in Japan, when we read the translated text, we should be able to get to know Japan in its culture through our Indian lenses. The second phase set by Goethe is through substitution and reproduction. Substitution and reproduction, where the translator absorbs a sense of a foreign work but reproduces it in his own terms. The third phase, which he considers the highest, is one which aims for perfect identity between the SL text and the TL text, and the achieving of this mode must be through the creation of a new manner which fuses the uniqueness of the original with a new form and structure. Towards the end of the 18th century, in 1791, Alexander Fraser Tytler published a volume entitled The Principles of Translation, the first systematic study in English of the translation processes. Tytler set up three basic principles. First one, the translation should give a complete transcript of the idea of the original work. Number two, the style and manner of writing should be of the same character with that of the original. And the third principle is the translation should have all the ease of the original composition. Tytler was against Dryden's idea of paraphrasing. I already told you why Dryden preferred method, why his method didn't work, because it led to many loose translations. Now, during Romanticism, that is our next period, During Romanticism, English and German translation theories raised questions of how to define translation, whether to see translation as a creative or as a mechanical enterprise. So many texts were translated at this time that critics have found it difficult to distinguish between influence study and translation study proper. There were two conflicting tendencies in approaching translation in the early 19th century. One exalts translation as a category of thought, with the translator seen as a creative genius in his own right, in touch with the genius of his original and enriching the literature and language into which he is translating. The other sees translation in terms of the more mechanical function of making known a text or author. But the question is, which one was seen superior? You should know that Coleridge had come up with his Biographia Literaria in 1817, where he outlined his theory of distinction between fancy and imagination. This is a very popular theory. He praised imagination. The preeminence of the imagination as opposed to the fancy led to the assumption that translation must be inspired with some creative force. In other words, the translator wasn't seen as equal to a creative writer. Poet Shelley also saw translation as an activity of lower status. Next time period is the post-Romantic period. All you have to remember from this period is that many critics saw the need of a sub-language for translation. What is a sub-language? A sub-language is a variety of language used in a particular field or by a particular professional group and characterized especially by distinctive vocabulary. The most popular translator theorist of this era is Frederick Schleyer, a German theologian and philosopher. In a lecture on the different methods of translation, he said, "There are only two methods of translating. Either the translator leaves the audience in peace as much as possible and moves the reader towards him, or he leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the author towards him." But Schleiermacher shows respect for the original work. He holds that a translator should be faithful to the original and should not make it easier for the reader, and faithfulness should be the most important factor in translation. Now we are closing to the modern period. Let's talk about the Victorian era. The general understanding of translation of the Victorian era can be summed up like this. On the one hand, there is an immense respect for the original text, but that respect is based on the individual writer's sureness of its worth. In other words, the translator invites the intellectual, cultivated reader to share what he decided to be an enriching experience, either on moral or aesthetic grounds. Moreover, the original text is perceived as a property, as an item of beauty to be added to a collection, and there is no consideration to the contemporary reader. So we can say that the translations were designed to be read by a minority. The translators implicitly reject the ideal of universal literacy. The intellectual reader represented a very small minority in the increasingly diffuse reading public that expanded throughout the century, and hence the foundations were laid for the notion of translation as a minority interest. If I am going to simplify that, it goes like this. Victorian era was a snobbish era. People were really adamant, elitist, and they never cared about the common man and his access to translated texts. So they only cared about the highly educated upper class readers. Matthew Arnold, in his first lecture on translating Homer, advises the lay reader means the common reader, to put his trust in scholars, for they alone can say whether the translation produces more or less the same effect as the original. He gives the following advice to the would-be translator. The advice goes like this. The translator must focus on the SL text primarily and must serve that text with complete commitment. The TL reader must be brought to the SL text through the means of the translation. Do you understand what he is saying? Here we can see how he underestimates the ordinary TL reader, a common man. Look, what you need to know about Victorians are that they're very snobbish, and it is not only the case of the English. Almost every nation in Europe had their own language and culture at their pedestal. So, translation was no more viewed as an activity to enrich their culture. Their language or culture didn't need any enrichment, you see. And again, the translator's job was not to simplify the whole procedure by making the ST understandable to the TT readers. Because then where is his chance to show off his talents and intellectual capabilities? So the concerns of the TL reader were of least importance. ST means source text, TT means target text. So when I say ST readers, ST means source text and TT readers means target text readers. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, an English poet and translator, said that the business of a translator is to report what the author says, not to explain what he means. Explaining is the work of the commentator. What an author says and how he says it, that is a problem of the translator. In complete contrast to Longfellow's view, Edward Fitzgerald, who is best known for his version of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in 1858, he believed that a translator's job is to bring a version of the SL text into the TL culture as a living entity. But you see, Fitzgerald was also an elitist and didn't prefer the TL reader among common men. In the next section, titled Archaizing, which means consciously imitating a word or a style of language or art that is very old or old-fashioned, Susan Basnett, she calls our attention to the faults of the Victorian translators. We already saw how the elitism and arrogance of the Victorian translator devalued or demoted the original text. Some critics say that the Victorians tried to colonize their past also by translation. You get it? They had already colonized 1/3 of the world. Now, by translating old SL texts, they are looking to demote those ancient cultures just like how they did with the Orient. It's funny how the Englishmen thought they could corrupt anything and everything with their guns and their 26 alphabets of a language. Okay, enough of the English. Now we are going to the 20th century. The first half of the 20th century had the same arrogance of the Victorian concepts of translation. Let's say literalness, archaizing, pedantry, and the production of a text of second-rate literary merit for an elite minority. It is ironical because this was also the period of new criticism. New criticism is where linguistics and communication were of higher importance in studying a text. But there are a few who deserve praise in studying translation as a theory. Ezra Pound's works, Hilaire Belloc's Taylorian lecture on translation in 1931, and James McFarlane's article Modes of Translation published in 1953. They are to be noted during this time. There was also a steady growth of valuable works on translation in English since the late 1950s. So we saw everything that happened with regard to translation in this unit. Remember, the purpose of studying the history of translation theory or activity will help us to study text in its contemporary time. Also, it will guide us to improve our understanding of what should be the goal of translation in our world. Thank you for listening. We will meet again for types of translation in the next class. Bye-bye.